The laughter stopped so suddenly that even the Roots looked up from their instruments. Jimmy Fallon, mid-gesture with his coffee mug, froze, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire Tonight Show. 300 audience members fell silent. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in Studio 6B knew they were no longer watching television. They were witnessing something raw, something real, something that would haunt them long after the stage lights dimmed. It had started as the perfect late-night segment. Trae Young, the Atlanta Hawks' electric point guard, was supposed to be the ideal guest. Young, charismatic, fresh off a career-high 48-point game against the Lakers. The producers had planned basketball trick shots, maybe some video games, the usual mix of athleticism and comedy that made great TV. But now, surrounded by the glittering New York skyline backdrop and the familiar blue glow of the Tonight Show set, something had shifted. The playful energy that had carried them through the first 10 minutes of the interview had evaporated, replaced by a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the studio. "So, Trae," Jimmy had said, bouncing slightly in his chair with that infectious enthusiasm that made him America's favorite late-night host. "You've made some incredible shots in your career. Game winners, buzzer beaters. Shots that probably still give Hawks fans chills. What would you say is the most important shot you've ever taken?" It was supposed to be an easy question, a setup for highlights, maybe a funny story about pressure or preparation. Jimmy expected to hear about Madison Square Garden, or a playoff moment, or perhaps that legendary shot against the Knicks that had the internet buzzing for weeks. Instead, Trae Young looked down at his hands. His usual confident smile, the one that had charmed late-night audiences and basketball fans alike, faded completely. When he looked back up, Jimmy saw something in the young athlete's eyes that stopped his host instincts cold. Pain, deep, adult pain that seemed impossible for someone so young to carry. "The most important shot I ever took," Trae said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio's air conditioning, "wasn't in the NBA. It wasn't even in college. It was when I was 12 years old, in a hospital parking lot in Oklahoma City." The audience stirred slightly, sensing the shift but not yet understanding its magnitude. Jimmy leaned forward, his professional antenna picking up something significant, but not yet knowing where this was headed. "A hospital parking lot?" Jimmy asked gently, his voice instinctively dropping to match Trae's tone. Trae nodded, and for a moment, he seemed to shrink in the guest chair, looking less like a professional athlete and more like the 12-year-old boy he was describing. "There was this kid," he began, then stopped. His hands, which had been resting casually on the chair arms, now gripped them tightly. His name was Tyler. Tyler Morrison. He was 8 years old, and he was dying. The word hung in the studio air like a thunderclap. Jimmy's coffee mug, which he'd been holding throughout the interview, slowly lowered to his desk. Behind them, the Roots had gone completely still. Even Questlove, usually animated and responsive, sat motionless behind his drums. "My mom," Trae continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "She volunteered at the children's cancer ward. She'd been taking me there since I was little, just to play with the kids. Maybe bring some happiness to their day. Tyler had been there for 3 months. Leukemia. The doctors had tried everything. Jimmy Harvey found himself in completely uncharted territory. In 15 years of hosting The Tonight Show, through thousands of interviews with celebrities, politicians, and everyday heroes, he had developed an instinct for these moments. But this felt different. This felt sacred. "Tyler loved basketball," Trae went on, and now his voice was steady, but thick with emotion. "He was too weak to play, but he'd watch games on the little TV in his room. He knew every player, every stat, and for some reason, he'd gotten obsessed with this 12-year-old kid from Norman, Oklahoma, who was supposedly pretty good at basketball." The realization hit Jimmy like a physical force. "You, me," Trae confirmed. "My mom had shown him some videos of me playing in youth leagues, just trying to give him something to be excited about. And Tyler, This little kid who could barely sit up in bed became my biggest fan. He had my youth league schedule memorized. He knew my stats better than I did. The camera operators, professionals who had filmed everything from presidential interviews to celebrity meltdowns, found themselves wiping their eyes. In the control room, producers who usually focused on segment timing and commercial breaks were leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story unfolding on their screens. One day, Trae continued, the doctors told Tyler's parents that he had maybe a week left, maybe less. And Tyler, this 8-year-old kid facing the unthinkable, had one request. He wanted to see me play basketball one more time. Jimmy's throat felt tight. He glanced at his cue cards, but the questions written there seemed absurd now. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was a confession, a sharing of something so personal that it transcended entertainment entirely. The problem was, Trae said, I didn't have a game scheduled for 2 weeks. Too far away. So my mom, she called the hospital, talked to Tyler's parents, and they came up with this idea. The hospital had a basketball hoop in their parking lot, just a basic setup for staff and families to blow off steam. My mom asked if maybe Tyler could watch from his window while I shot around in the parking lot. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed loud. Jimmy realized he was holding his breath. So we went. Trae continued. Tyler's room was on the 3rd floor, and his parents wheeled his bed right up to the window. I could see him up there, this tiny little face pressed against the glass, wearing a hospital gown that was way too big for him. And I started shooting. Trae paused and Jimmy could see him fighting back tears. I made maybe 10 shots in a row, nothing special, just basic jumpers. But Tyler, even from that distance, was cheering. His parents told me later that he was using what little strength he had to clap every time the ball went through the net. Then Tyler's mom came down to the parking lot. She said Tyler had a request. He wanted to see me make one shot from really far away, like impossibly far. And if I made it, Tyler said he'd know that miracles were real. Jimmy felt his own eyes filling with tears. Around the studio, audience members were openly crying. This wasn't the manufactured emotion of reality television. This was something pure, something that cut straight to the heart of what it meant to be human. So I backed up, Trae said, his voice now barely above a whisper. All the way to the edge of the parking lot. It had to be at least 60 feet. An impossible shot for a 12-year-old. For anyone, really. And I looked up at Tyler's window, and he was there, watching, believing. The pause that followed seemed to last forever. Jimmy wanted to ask what happened, but somehow he knew that words would only diminish what Trae was sharing. I took the shot, Trae said finally, and somehow, impossibly, it went in. Perfect swish. Tyler went crazy in his window, and I could see his parents crying, and for just a moment, it felt like anything was possible. Jimmy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring about his makeup or how it would look on camera. That's incredible, he managed to say. But Trae wasn't finished. Tyler died 3 days later, he said quietly. His parents called to tell me. And at the funeral, Tyler's mom told me something that I think about every single day. She said that in Tyler's last 3 days, he kept talking about that shot. He kept saying that if a 12-year-old kid could make an impossible shot, then impossible things could happen. And somehow that gave him peace. The studio was silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. Jimmy looked out at his audience and saw 300 faces reflecting the same mix of heartbreak and wonder that he felt in his own chest. Every shot I take, Trae continued, his voice stronger now. Every game I play, every time I step on a basketball court, I think about Tyler. I think about that impossible shot. And I remember that sometimes we do things not because we think we can, but because someone else needs to believe we can. Jimmy Harvey, the man who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, found himself completely speechless. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood that this moment required something beyond words. Without thinking, without consulting producers, or considering cameras, Jimmy stood up from behind his desk. The action felt natural, necessary, like gravity pulling him towards something important. He walked around to where Trae was sitting, and in front of 300 strangers and millions of viewers, pulled the young athlete into a hug. It wasn't a quick television-friendly embrace. It was the kind of hug that acknowledges shared humanity, that recognizes when someone has trusted you with their most sacred story. Jimmy held Trae for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. And in that time, The Tonight Show became something it had never been before. A place where grief and hope could coexist, where impossible shots could still echo across years and touch hearts in ways that transcended basketball entirely. When they finally separated, Jimmy kept his hand on Trae's shoulder. "Tyler would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just of the player you became, but of the man who remembers him, who carries his story, who makes sure his belief in miracles lives on." The audience erupted then, not in the polite applause of a talk show, but in the kind of standing ovation that comes from the deepest places of human recognition. They were applauding Trae, yes, but they were also applauding Tyler, and impossible shots, and the miracle of connection that can happen between strangers when someone is brave enough to share their truth. As the applause continued, Jimmy looked directly into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "that's not just basketball. That's not just sports. That's what it looks like when we play for something bigger than ourselves. That's what it looks like when we remember that every shot we take, every choice we make, every moment we have the chance to believe in the impossible. Someone might be watching from a window, hoping for a miracle." The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove the tears, the silence, or the moment when television became something more profound. It became the most watched Tonight Show segment of the year, shared millions of times across social media. Not because of its entertainment value, but because it reminded people that in a world that often feels disconnected and cynical, stories of love and hope and impossible shots can still bring us together. Trae Young went on to have an incredible season. But reporters noticed something different about his post-game interviews. When asked about difficult shots or clutch moments, he would often mention playing for people who couldn't play anymore, for kids who believed in miracles, for the idea that impossible shots sometimes go in when they matter most. And Jimmy Fallon learned something that night that changed how he approached every interview afterward. That the most powerful moments in television happen not when you ask the right questions, but when you create space for people to share the stories that have shaped them, even when those stories break your heart and remind you that some things matter more than entertainment. Because sometimes, the most important shot isn't the one that wins the game. It's the one that reminds an 8-year-old boy that miracles are real, and reminds the rest of us that they still happen every time someone chooses to believe in the impossible. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. The clip of Trae's story spread across the internet like wildfire, but not in the usual way celebrity moments go viral. This wasn't about entertainment or shock value. Parents shared it with their children, coaches showed it to their teams. Hospitals across the country reported an increase in athlete visits to pediatric wards. The Tyler Morrison Foundation was established within a month, funded by donations from viewers who had been moved by Trae's story. The foundation provides basketball hoops for children's hospitals and organizes visits from athletes to spend time with young patients. The first hoop was installed at the Oklahoma City Children's Hospital where Tyler had been treated, positioned so it could be seen from the third-floor windows. Jimmy received thousands of letters from viewers, sharing their own stories of impossible moments, of small acts of kindness that had changed lives, of times when someone had believed in them when belief seemed impossible. The Tonight Show staff started a new segment called Impossible Shots, featuring everyday people who had done extraordinary things for others. But perhaps the most profound change was in Trae himself. He began ending every post-game interview the same way, looking directly into the camera and saying, "This one was for you, Tyler. Young cancer patients across the country started wearing Hawks jerseys to their treatments, drawing strength from the story of a boy who had believed in miracles, and the athlete who had carried that belief forward. 3 years later, on the anniversary of Tyler's death, Trae returned to that hospital parking lot in Oklahoma City. Tyler's parents were there, along with dozens of current patients and their families. Trae didn't just shoot baskets that day. He sat with every child, listened to their stories, and reminded each one that they were capable of impossible things. Tyler would have been 11 now, Trae told Jimmy during a return visit to The Tonight Show. And I think about the man he would have become, the impossible shots he would have taken in his own life. That's what keeps me going, playing not just for the Tyler who was, but for the Tyler who could have been. Jimmy nodded, understanding now that some stories don't end when the telling stops. They live on in the choices we make, in the belief we carry, in the impossible shots we keep taking for people who can no longer take them themselves. The basketball Trae used that day in the hospital parking lot sits in Tyler's childhood bedroom, now preserved as a memorial. On it, written in fading marker, are the words Tyler's mother had penned the day before he died. Miracles happen when someone believes they can. And in arenas across the country, every time Trae Young steps to the free throw line, he looks up toward the rafters and whispers, "This one's for you, buddy." Because some shots transcend basketball. Some shots carry the weight of promises made to children who believed in the impossible. And some shots, taken by 12-year-old boys in hospital parking lots, echo through time, reminding us all that miracles aren't just possible, they're necessary. The impossible shot lives on, taken again and again by anyone who chooses to believe that love can triumph over loss, that hope can overcome heartbreak, and that sometimes, when it matters most, the impossible becomes inevitable.